Ferraris have always tried to bridge the gap between performance and luxury, working hard to make both better and trying not to sacrifice either of them. You can see this in their modern lineup today, or throughout their entire history and their entire lineup of cars. Making refined luxury sports cars, having the ability to push it when you need to put your foot down, but also give you a comfortable ride around. Not many of the cars that Ferrari have made, and none of them that are currently making, are described as a purebred race car. But that's probably a very fair estimate of the current demand in the market. But there was a time when Ferrari thought there was just enough demand in the market to create a purebred race car for the road. And who else better to fill this demand than Ferrari themselves? This is when Ferrari decided to make the F40, the last car that was ever personally approved by Enzo Ferrari. And the car that was unapologetically raw. It was the fastest, most powerful, and most expensive road car when it was produced. Despite its cult-like status now, when it was first produced, it faced a lot of criticism. Some critics claimed that the car didn't have a lot of amenities, not for driving purity, but to get it out to customers as soon as possible. This because Porsche, just 1 year earlier, had released the 959, the fastest car and most technologically advanced when it was produced. The other criticism was the price. The F40 was 5 times more expensive than the outgoing 288 GTO. Even Gordon Murray, who would go on to create cars like the F1 and SLR Mercedes McLaren, had to say that the F1 was just a big go-kart with a plastic body on it, suggesting that the technology was outdated and saying that it wobbled all over the road when it drove. But even with those negative reviews, the car was still a marvel of engineering. Sure, it didn't have some of the amenities that the 959 had, but that was to save weight, which was a major part in the designing of the car. The car only weighed 3,000 pounds, and had a 2.9-liter twin-turbocharged V8 that was the same powerhouse with some modifications as the 288 GTO, which was the car before the F40. The reason why it was the same engine was because the F40 was only developed in 13 months by the design firm Pininfarina, under the direction of Enzo Ferrari. The designers were Leonardo Florovetti, Pietro Camedella, and Niccolo Mattezzi. It was to keep the car as light as possible, so they used body panels that were a combination of Kevlar, carbon fiber, and aluminum. This was to have the maximum amount of strength and to lower the weight. To further minimize the weight, they used polycarbonate plastic for the windshield and windows, instead of just using glass. To keep the car as light as possible, many things that you'd find in a modern-day Ferrari were sacrificed in F40. There was no sound system, door handles, glove box, leather trim, carpet, or door panels. There was no roll-down windows, instead just a shifting window, or even a spare tire. When it came to the driving, there was no power steering, assisted braking, traction control, and no driver-assisted electronics. Because of this, the car was too Spartan to many early reviewers. Despite the early criticisms, however, the car became an almost instant classic. Many drivers of the car believed it to be the perfect driving car, acknowledging that the F40 required operators to possess driving skill that was beyond the range of the average driver, which is one of the reasons why the trip to Italy to learn how to drive the car was included in the price. Journalists who could handle the driving an automobile with no modern driving assist and power said the car was agile, balanced, and possessed unbelievable cornering grip when driven with a skilled driver. Ferrari had planned to only make 400 F40s, but demand was so high for them that they made over 1,300 of them. Even though the car was built off the 288 GTO, a car that was built for racing, there was no plan to make a race version of the F40. Instead, just to create the most capable road car ever. This was because Ferrari was trying to do no racing besides from F1. But this amount of demand for the Ferrari would start the development of the F40 LM. The LM would make its first debut at Laguna Seca while it was doing IMSA racing. It finished third in its first race, very respectable, especially since the two cars in first and second were Audi GTOs with four-wheel drive and some of the most dominant cars in a racing series, but also because all of the cars on the track were made as race cars with race car chassis, including the Audis. But the F40 was based on its road car chassis with slight modifications to make it better for racing. The F40 would not race again that season, but in the next season it would get a few more podiums in IMSA, but never that desired top spot. In Europe, the BPR Racing Series would start in 1994, and even though the F40 was 7 years old at this point, it was still seen as a top GT car in Europe. Standell took the risk and bought an F40 for the series. It would do well that season, winning the 4 Hours of Vallelonga. The next season, it would win the 4 Hours of Anderstorp, but that season the McLaren F1 would be entered in 1996, and it would be completely dominating the BPR, making the F40 and the other cars in the series no longer very competitive. But the F40 returned for one more year, and surprisingly the outdated F40 managed to repeat its previous year's Anderstorp win, and from there on it was no longer seen in the BPR GT Racing Series. The F40 would also be entered in some local Italian GT car championships. It did very well in these, although it is safe to say that the other racers in these series weren't necessarily the most impressive race cars ever. Potentially the ultimate F40 ever made was the Competizione. Very similar to the LM, the Competizione was a result of a customer request from a French importer who wanted to enter an F40 into the 24 Hours of Le Mans. 10 examples of the Competizione were built, all at customer demand, but the first 2 are still called F40 LMs. This car was very similar to the LM version, but had a bit more horsepower than both the normal F40 and the F40 LM. Despite the F40's less than legendary results on the racetrack, it was able to gain a legendary reputation due to its basic, pure driving feel. Sure, it didn't have the technology or sophistication of the 959 or later supercars, but it feels more agile, precise, even compared to some of its modern rivals. Beautifully simple, not overcomplicating the design or the mechanics. Despite the early criticism, the F40 became an icon of the car. The ultimate Ferrari, the ultimate supercar, the F40.